Hello, dear friends and adventurers. It's Rob, the D&D wannabe, here with some exciting news. This podcast is now made possible in partnership with our good friends at Misty Mountain Gaming. Veteran-owned and operated, Misty Mountain is one of the largest dice companies in the world. They offer the widest selection of metal, gemstone, and glass dice combined. For yourself, that special role player in your life, or your favorite podcast hosts. Just saying. Look for their booth at your next local comic, anime, or gaming convention, or find their products at mistymountaingaming.com. Okay, on with the show.
Oh, hello there, listener. Tell me, does the combat at your table sometimes sound like this? Alright, Gore, you miss the green dragon with your attacks. It's going to make a tail attack against you, and it hits on an 18, so you take 15 damage.
Bummer.
Rob, what do you want to do with your turn?
Okay, I will take my sword and attack it.
Okay.
I would hit a 20.
Yeah, its AC's 19. That hits.
Okay. 10 damage.
Okay, cool. Good job.
I'd like to use my bonus action.
Oh, sure. Sorry, go ahead.
And inspire Dave.
Okay. Dave, you're, super inspired. All right, yeah, on to Ren's turn. Oh my, how blasé. Why, a person might fall asleep listening to such unimaginative drivel such as that. But what if, instead of just going through the motions, we took the time to invest in our players' immersion and focused on the narrative that was taking place? Why, you may find that it sounds something a little more like this. Gore, you're unable to find a weakness against this green dragon's scaly hide. Again and again, you smash into it with your longsword, but it's not making any difference. The dragon laughs at you, turning around and swinging its tail to attack you. Does a 19 hit your AC?
Yeah.
Okay, that means that you're going to be knocked back against the wall as you take 15 bludgeoning damage.
I am almost down.
Seeing this, Llewellyn, what would you like to do?
All right. So Llewellyn draws his rapier, seeing Gore, his ally, smashed up against the wall, and he charges in, noticing that Gore's repeated blows in that same area have left the dragon's scales weakened, and aiming for that vulnerability, he charges in, thrusting upward with his rapier.
Make your roll.
Right. Oh, yeah. 18 plus 8, 26.
Oh my gosh. All right, Llewellyn, you run up to the green dragon, sliding underneath the tail as it whips around past Gore, and then stabbing upward with your rapier and pushing it all the way in up to the hilt. You pull it back out, spraying yourself with some warm blood and viscera as you do so. The dragon reels in pain. What else would you like to do?
All right. Enjoying the warm spray, I turn my newly painted crimson visage to my ally Gore and say, "Be not discouraged, friend. The beast will die this day." And I would like to inspire him.
All right, perfect. Gore, you see that your efforts have not been in vain. You weakened the dragon enough for Llewellyn to get in there and make a successful attack. And with his encouraging words, you know, you were starting to feel like this was hopeless. But now, you think you might have a chance.
Hell yeah, we got this, man.
All right, Ren, it's your turn. What would you like to do? Should you wish to learn how to make the combats at your table more compelling in such a manner, then it's a good thing you tuned in this week to Bardic Twinspiration. Welcome back to Bardic Twinspiration. Thanks for joining us again this week. My name is Steven, I'm your host, and I am joined here by my co-host.
Hi, I'm D&D wannabe. My name is Rob. I am Steve's twin brother, and I've been running Dungeons & Dragons for 7 years. I am a Dungeons & Dragons content creator, a writer, and recently a podcast co-host.
Whereas I am merely a podcast co-host, a one-time DM, and a player for the past 7 years. But we hope to be able to give you a little bit of input and advice that might help you out at your table. Today, we are continuing our series on combat and ways to make it a little bit more engaging for your table, whether you're a player or a DM.
That's right. Combat can be a little bit of a slog when initiative is rolled. Things start happening in turns, and the flow of the game is broken a little bit as you transition into this entirely separate set of mechanics from the rest of the game.
Which is totally counterintuitive, right? Because you would think that combat would be the most exciting part of your game, and yet it seems to also be kind of the most procedural by virtue of being the most mechanically demanding.
Yep, very first thing you do is get in a queue and wait in line, and just hope that you're somewhere near the front.
I never am.
Well, for all the rogues you play, you'd think you'd roll better.
Yeah, if I can roll, I can roll well anywhere but initiative. It's gone on for 7 years.
No, but that is kind of a thing. Like, when initiative is rolled, everything stops, and then you start taking turns and going around the table, and that's kind of the way it has to happen. But this is the part where the phones come out around the table, right? Where everyone starts checking Twitter, or seeing the latest TikTok video, or just kind of amusing themselves while they wait for their turn in initiative to come up. And so you're not paying attention to what your friends are doing. You're not paying attention to what the DM is saying. I mean, at a good table, you are. But it's not always a good table.
Right, yeah. I've been at a couple of tables that it really feels like you're playing like an old school turn-based Final Fantasy game or something like that, right? Like, you have the heroes who run up and attack the villain, and then the villain just stands there and takes it because it's not the villain's turn yet. So why would we bother having it do anything but absorbing a blow? And then it's the next person's turn. And it doesn't matter how much as a player you're paying attention, because sometimes that's all you're given. But maybe you can do something to change that.
And like you're saying, D&D and turn-based video games are about the only mediums that you can get away with this sort of thing. Because in movies or in theater or even in radio, you're expected to be kept engaged by constant drama, by constant action. And even though there technically is constant action going on in a D&D combat, a lot of times it doesn't run that way, and it's not played that way, and most importantly, it doesn't feel that way.
Right, and so that's what we're going to talk to you about today, in the hopes that we can kind of add some of that back in to your games and at your tables. So first off, let's give an example of kind of what we're going for here.
Okay, so anyone who's listened to me talk on the subject knows that I'm a big fan of The Princess Bride.
Yep.
It is one of my favorite movies, and I will defend its validity and its place in cinema staunchly against all comers. And one of the reasons is because the combats are so exciting. And it's not because they are so technically profound. I will be the first to admit that sometimes it's just wobbling flimsy pieces of metal, generally in the direction of another person.
Yeah, combats have definitely gotten a lot more exciting in the last few decades, thanks to some very enthusiastic choreographers and lots of flashy special effects.
But you cannot deny that there is always something happening, that it is consistently dramatic, and that the people on screen, the characters involved in the conflict, are giving it everything they've got.
Right, and I feel like that combat, let's specifically, I'm sure, we're talking about the one between Inigo Montoya and the Dread Pirate Roberts after the kidnapping of Princess Buttercup.
Yes, I'm aware that there is more movie around that particular scene, but I forget that sometimes. Because that is my favorite scene.
Right, yeah, and it has been since we were kids because, there's people sword fighting in that scene. And there is a whole lot of drama, and there's, they're holding back, but now they're not, but now he's holding back. It's a really great scene. One of the things that I think is so important about that scene is how both the Dread Pirate Roberts and Inigo are both showing off their skills, and that skill is readily evident to the other party in that combat.
Right.
And I think we miss out on that sometimes in D&D.
At no point during that fight do you think, oh, these guys don't know what they're doing, or, if they were just trying a little harder, or if luck had been on their side, maybe things would have turned out differently. No, it was entirely dependent on the skill of the two combatants, and at no point during that fight did one party involved just cleanly miss the other with their blade, right? It's constantly feinting and parrying and thrusting and deflecting the other's attacks. The fact that neither of them died seconds into that combat is not due to the ineptitude of the attacker, but due to the skill of the person they're attacking.
Right, and when they do miss each other, it's because there was a skillful dodge being employed at that time. So, why is it at some D&D tables that I've been at, whenever I, as a player character, make my attack to hit the enemy, be it a monster, a beast, or another, melee combatant, that if I roll a 2, it just means I whiffed. That doesn't feel right. That doesn't honor my character's competency or his agency as a hero to just be like, yeah, that guy was just standing there and you took a swing, but it came up short. Or you just swung it right over his head for some reason.
I think it's a common misconception for players and dungeon masters that not dealing damage to the target of your attack means that your weapon must not have gone anywhere near them. Which sounds dumb.
Yeah, because, a weapon is such a deadly item, surely if it comes into contact with this other player at all, that means that they're going to die. No, and you know what? I'm even contributing to the problem here, because I just called failing to meet an opponent's AC a miss, which it is not necessarily at any point that I know of in any official published material does Wizards of the Coast refer to that as a miss. Hey there, listener. Future Steve here, stepping in to correct past Steve's mistake. It turns out that Wizards of the Coast actually frequently uses the term miss to refer to failing to meet or exceed a target's AC. Rob, who actually owns the source books and has read almost everything that Wizards of the Coast has published, was able to find multiple instances of this within just a few minutes after we finished the episode. Yeah, my bad, guys. Rob and I both agree, however, that the approach that we're describing in this episode is a much better way to convey the obvious narrative intent of what armor class is supposed to provide, and a more immersive way to handle the situation when it comes up during your combats. Alright, back to the episode. It's called armor class for a reason. So, I'm going to pull from your knowledge here. What exactly makes up someone's armor class?
So, an armor class is generally composed of a base number, usually 10, plus their dexterity modifier. Mm-hmm. If the person, character, creature in question is wearing armor, that base number is increased, and you still add the dexterity modifier. Sometimes it's capped, depending on if you're wearing medium armor, or heavy armor has a high enough base number that you don't get to add anything to it. But unless you're a barbarian or a monk who calculates their armor class in a different way, it's usually armor plus how quickly you can move.
So, tell me a little bit about what the AC is actually supposed to represent in combat.
Alright, so you're coming at me. Well, I hope you're not coming at me. An enemy is coming at my character with a weapon of me destruction. Let's say it's a Morning Star, because Morning Stars don't get enough love. Bugbear with a Morning Star is coming at Llewellyn the Bard. He rolls to hit, adds his modifiers, and is trying to deal damage to me. The first thing he has to contend with is that base number, which is my armor. If he hits that armor, the armor is going to do its job and pad that blow. It's going to soften that impact and protect the person wearing it.
Right.
Since Llewellyn is a bard, he's obviously wearing light armor and is probably a dexterous fellow. Mm-hmm. So he is able to move well in that armor, so it's very likely that seeing a charging bugbear with a big off mace, he might well just sidestep the attack entirely because Llewellyn's just that good.
Yeah, and there's a lot of different ways that you can impact your AC as well. It should encapsulate your the protection that you are wearing, or if you have a shield, the protection that you're carrying. It should constitute.
I always forget about shields. I don't think I've ever played a character that used a shield.
Yeah, you actually played a character that had a shield and didn't use it. So, so in addition to that, there's your dexterity bonus, which is going to represent your character's ability to dodge an incoming blow. And then there's a lot of other things that can increase your armor class. Like if you're a mage and you cast the mage armor spell, you're using arcane energy woven around yourself to facsimilate a representation of armor that's going to provide the same function. Or there's the shield spell, which I recently fell in love with. Why did I never play a caster that took this before? Wherein you use arcane energy to deflect incoming attacks. There's a lot of stuff that goes into calculating your character's armor class that represents their overall ability to defend themselves against incoming attacks.
And I think it's important that those defenses are represented that way. The greatest fighter in the world, the greatest combatant, I should say, not to confuse our classes, could face off against someone who is incredibly well defended and may not have much luck. Mm-hmm. The old argument of the world's greatest spear versus the world's greatest shield, who would win? And in both cases, it's the world's greatest, one thing or the other.
Right.
And when you're dealing with Dungeons & Dragons combat, you have to assume that these adventurers, whatever level they are at, are standouts. They are exemplary combatants who have trained, who have studied the blade, who have practiced their magics, who are invested in their own survival and the demise of those who stand against them.
Right.
They know what they're doing.
I do feel a little bit cheated. I feel a little bit robbed when someone takes my character, my, level 16 Dragonborn Paladin, and I take an attack at the Rakshasa, and they just say, oh, well, you just missed. That Rakshasa's working pretty darn hard not to get hit, and it just so happens that he worked a little bit harder not to get hit than I did to try to hit him. So please, do your players, if you're a DM, do your players a favor, and unless you're going for a slapstick campaign, which I've been in some of those, and they're really fun, but unless you're going for that, if you're going for something on a little bit more serious, a more dramatic sort of note, honor their character's capabilities. Make it not so much about how incapable that hero is when they roll a natural one, or when they don't, whatever their role is. If they fail to meet their target's AC, make it about how imposing and how scary and how capable their opponent is.
I think it's especially important to honor that when it comes to the martial classes, the guys who run in there with sword and board to take it to the enemy firsthand. Because when it comes to spellcasters, casting a spell and the enemy rolls a saving throw, there's never anything wrong with the wizard's spell, with the sorcerers, the druids, the bards, the clerics' spell. Mm-hmm. When the enemy, the target, rolls that saving throw, they're succeeding because of their competence, because of their physical or mental defenses. Why are we not giving the martial classes that same credit?
When we were prepping for this episode and you mentioned that, I was like, yeah, I always play martial classes. What's going on here? Why is this my problem? Because, what? Did the wizard cast a bad firebolt or something like that? No. Oh, what's one that has a saving throw? That Sacred Flame, right?
Fireball.
Yeah. Did the cleric cast a bad Sacred Flame? No. The other guy just got out of the way. He made a saving throw. So what? Did I just cast a bad sword? Did I cast longbow incorrectly? Why is this my problem? But yeah, we got to talking about this prior to the episode. Yeah, martial classes should not have to die on that hill. But you can make this more narrative regardless of what sort of class it is that you're playing. You can make the fighters' melee attacks more narrative and more engaging, more descriptive for the players. That's really going to draw everyone in and increase everyone's feeling of, yeah, I'm here to be a hero and I'm doing my job. Whether the attack hits or quote unquote misses, I have to say that because no one can see my air quotes. So let's give a couple of examples here. So
Sure.
You're Llewellyn the Bard, which, by the way, that's a real character of yours, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
Okay, so you're Llewellyn the Bard, you have your rapier, and you're coming up against the King's Champion in the gladiatorial arena. Why you, Llewellyn the Bard, have ended up in a gladiatorial arena, mistakes have been made.
Mistakes were made, I was going to say.
I'm just assuming that you woke up hungover this way.
What does it say? The risk I took was calculated, but hoo boy, am I bad at math.
I've never heard that. That's great. Okay, so you're up against the King's Champion in the middle of the gladiatorial arena. You try to take stabs at him again and again with your rapier, trying to create an opening for a killing blow, but the King's Champion just effortlessly parries every blow, rallying the crowd to cheer him on while he does so. You know, that's a situation, that's a scene that we're creating here that has a lot less to do about your inability to hit him. You're swinging that sword all the time. It's more about his ability to defend himself.
And you touched on a pretty important point there that I don't know if you wanted to get into later.
Yes, let's get into that now. Let's do it now.
Here, wait a minute.
I'm hot under the collar.
Let me find your soapbox so you can stand on it.
No, I came prepared. I brought it with me. I started this episode on it, and I'm not getting off it till we're done.
All right, go ahead. Go cut loose, man.
Okay, so again, I have been at many tables. I like to play martial classes. I'm your paladin, you know. I'm your fighter.
You're our pal.
Yeah, I'm your pal Aiden. So I get multiple attacks per round, right? And a combat round is supposed to be 6 seconds long. If I have 2 attacks in my combat round, that doesn't mean that I only swing my sword 2 times. This is 6 seconds of melee combat with a bullet, or with a death knight, or with the King's Champion in the arena as I try my best to defend Llewellyn. I am going to be moving that sword constantly, just like in The Princess Bride, just like in Star Wars Episode 1, Qui-Gon Jinn, Darth Maul, Obi-Wan Kenobi, the Duel of the Fates scene,
Sure.
Pirates of the Caribbean, Will Turner, Jack Sparrow in the blacksmith shop. How many times in that fight, in any of those fights, did they just kind of stop? I was like, well, I don't know what to do with my other 5 seconds. I already swung my sword. You know, what you doing after this?
Nothing that is supposed to grip the interest of the viewer, or certainly of the participants, expects you to stand around. Another one of my favorite fights in cinema is Zorro and Elena in The Mask of Zorro. Constantly swords flashing back and forth between catty and flirtatious barbs and taunts at one another. But other than the moments where they, stopped to gaze at one another's various states of undress, swords were moving.
Yeah, that's another great fight. But the point is, if I have 1 or 2 or, even more attacks in a round, that doesn't mean that that's the maximum amount of times that I am moving my sword during this combat round. That means that's how many openings that I have created in the opponent's defense. That's how many times I got my sword on the other side of the shield. A battle's a dance. It's constant conflict and confrontation between 2 opposing parties. There are no breaks.
So to add to that, if you're getting multiple attacks in a round, it's not because you have suddenly learned to be able to swing your sword twice in 6 seconds. Once every 3 seconds, I am coming for your life with my greatsword, enemy. No, it means that you have become better at making those opportunities for yourself, that your feints are that much more convincing, that the strength with which you swing your weapon is capable of pushing aside or through your opponent's weapon and or having a chance, at least, to hit something important.
That is a very important perspective that I think, just a lot of people don't take the time to consider. This is completely unrelated, but there's a comic on Reddit, a D&D comic called Tater Pig, Taterpig. If you haven't looked it up yet, you should. And this goes for you, Rob, as well as our listeners. They had one comic where the fighter and the barbarian are having a conversation after having killed some enemies, and the fighter looks at the barbarian and says, "Hey, you know what? I just had this crazy idea. What if instead of trying to attack this guy once, I attacked him twice?" Barbarian says, "Hey, you know, that gives me an idea. What if instead of getting really, really mad once a day, I did it twice a day?" And then they both jumped in the air and we leveled up because that's how some people kind of think of it. But no, your perspective, I think, is much more in keeping with the narrative intent of your character's progression.
And that's a good word to use there. It's the narrative, right? The storytelling doesn't stop at initiative. That was kind of the point of one of our previous episodes. After initiative is rolled, things continue to happen. Players continue to act. Nothing stops. The story doesn't stop. And if the story doesn't stop, that means people are doing something.
Right. Yeah, and get ready, everyone, because that's the point of this one, too. We're continuing to tell you how to keep the narrative going during combat.
Stay tuned. We'll just keep telling you what to do.
All right. I'm going to burn through a couple more quick examples here, because if I took the time to write them, someone's going to listen to them. Gosh darn it.
Shoot.
All right. So we talked a little bit about melee combatants and what it looks like for them to, narratively describe what's happening on their turn. You're looking for that opening in the King's Champion's defense. You're trying to get your sword past the bugbear's shield. You're trying to get that chink in the dragon's scales. But what if we're talking about, say, archers? Because let's be honest, a lot of the characters in your party are more likely to be ranged than melee.
Yeah, there's rangers benefit well from being ranged combatants. There's fighter archetypes entirely designed around it. Llewellyn, although we've been using him with a rapier in previous examples, really does hate to get up and mix it up with things that are much bigger than him. So even he likes to utilize a hand crossbow or his spells from the back.
Right, and a lot of people tend to take that same negative approach to range combat that they do to melee combat.
I hold back on my arrow. I take aim. I fire, and I missed. And then I fired, and I missed. I missed both times.
So, for contrast, let's try... You draw back the bow and hold your breath, waiting for the bullet to present an opening. You know that the natural armor covering its body is nearly impenetrable, but it isn't without weaknesses. You just have to wait for the right opportunity. As it opens its mouth to attack your priest, you see your chance, loosing the arrow through its open maw and into the vulnerable flesh at the roof of its mouth. It's an option. That option's always there.
That's better. And you know what? If that attack roll doesn't go so well, don't just say, and you missed the giant, land shark that is attacking your priestly friend.
It is the broadside of a barn incarnate.
Say that it lowers its head to take a bite out of the priest, and your arrow deflects off of a giant tooth. Or your friend, the priest, steps slightly in the path of your arrow, and rather than risk hitting him, you divert your aim and hope to still hit the creature, but it glances off of its iron scales.
Ooh, yeah, I really like that one.
Just anything to give credit where it is due, to imply, not just imply, to state the competence of the player character who took levels in this class, who hunts creatures like this for a living, who could probably take monsters at least this difficult for breakfast, but just had a bum roll.
Yeah. And, we're thinking about the combat run of 6 seconds. So, how long does it really take to fire an arrow? Have you watched competitive shooting of any kind?
Yeah,
those shots take a minute to line up.
Yeah, not everybody is Legolas, like whipping things off of a short bow and just magically hoping that they hit. Although, you make a character with enough attacks in that 6-second round, you can get there.
Sure, yeah. I mean, this is D&D. Why not make Legolas?
But this is quality over quantity.
Temper your expectations,
right?
yeah.
If I've got a rogue say, who is going to have sneak attack, and he gets 1 attack per round, and maybe he's even got the sharpshooter feat to put some extra stank on that arrow, he is going to take his time lining up the perfect shot.
Yeah, that's totally what I had in mind when I was thinking of my little archer example there. But Rob, what about spellcasters?
So I think it is the easiest thing to describe where that 6 seconds goes for spellcasters, because I've watched Doctor Strange. If you see famously handsome person Benedict Cumberbatch waving his fingers around in midair and carving glowing sigils, just burning them into existence in the air around him, using these somatic components to his spells, or chanting an eldritch word or phrase to empower the magic, the arcane might that they are about to bring to bear, that takes effort and that takes time.
It does. Another example would be, and I'm going to pull the anime card here, Naruto.
Oh no.
Right? Yeah, you've got a whole bunch of little hand motions, a bunch of somatic components that are going to go into all the different jutsus that those ninjas perform, right? Like Chidori, Rasengan, all of those, they have tons of hand motions that you have to make. It takes a little while to prep. You know, even going as fast as they do, easily 6 seconds.
Yeah, all the finger tutting that they do does take time and does add up. Even though they are incredibly proficient at doing it quickly, it takes time.
Yeah, I mean, if you were to narratively describe what Sasuke is doing, you know, he is performing the hand gestures to align the chakras within his body in order to generate the lightning at the end of his hand. You can do that sort of thing with your clerics, your paladins, you know, like even your monks if you wanted to get into that sort of stuff.
That's a really good point. I hadn't thought of it quite that way in terms of D&D.
Yeah, but instead of just literally saying what you're doing with your hands, you can be describing what they're doing from an arcane sense. Like, okay, here's an example. This is a Lich casting counterspell on your lightning bolt, okay? The Lich hurriedly traces an arcane rune in the air, sowing disorder and chaos throughout the elemental magics that you were attempting to collect for your spell, rendering the lightning bolt inert. As opposed to, yeah, he counterspells that.
You know, there's probably a happy middle ground. But that was very engaging, what you just said. I had very little context. I wasn't emotionally invested in what the hell you were talking about, but when you said that, suddenly I was. You know, a dungeon master who's running more than just the Lich and his minions into combat and trying to keep track of all of the status effects that the Lich has bestowed on all the player characters, you know, might not have the presence of mind and the creativity to say exactly what you just said.
No, I mean, even Matt Mercer doesn't do that. I have the benefit of sitting down to type this stuff out before an episode, so of course not. But I'm hoping to kind of spark something.
Yeah, and really anything over, yeah, he counterspells that, is great. And the same thing from the players. Players know counterspell. I don't think I've sat at a table, or even watching Critical Role, where they narrate a counterspell. And it's a spell like any other. It's arguably an incredibly dramatic spell. You know, it's certainly in the finale of Critical Role, Campaign 1. That was a devastating, clutch counterspell. And the narration for it was, I cast counterspell at what level? Level 9. I mean, which is kind of all you need to say when you cast a level 9 counterspell. But man, that bore some weight.
It did.
That has been the topic of a lot of discussion since then, and could have been narrated a little better.
Exactly, and that's the way that I think that all of this should work. The player needs to describe their intent, and then they make the roll, and the DM describes what happens and narrates the consequences of that roll. It's the exact same way that we do it for skill checks. Whenever the DM calls for one, or, you know, hey, I would like to check the room for traps. Okay, Make an investigation check. I rolled this. This is what you find. Attacks should work the same way.
Yeah, this would normally be where I say something, but I just kind of agree.
Yeah.
So
I may leave that in. I like that. But this doesn't have to apply just to attacks. This can apply to defenses as well. And we've given a couple of examples of that. I have one that I particularly like where you, as the player character, are casting Blight on a gnoll. All right.
Poor
the
gnoll.
looks. What, is Blight going to just completely wreck his day? I have no idea.
Probably.
I don't know the monster manual. The gnoll looks shocked to see his veins on his hand rapidly darkening under the effects of your Blight spell. Without hesitation, it takes its knife and rips its own forearm open, spilling out the infected blood before it can reach its heart. It laughs hysterically, apparently reveling in the euphoria caused by fresh blood, regardless of the source. So, I mean, that's kind of a pretty in-depth way to narrate someone passing their saving throw. But what is Blight? Blight's a Constitution saving throw, right?
I think so.
Yeah, so I thought, well, how do you narrate a Constitution saving throw? It's just like, oh, well, you just resist it because you're tough.
Yeah, you grit your teeth.
No, you do something freaking tough, and that's how you get over it. You cut your own arm open to make sure the infected blood doesn't get back to your heart. That's how you pass a Constitution saving throw, buddy, or at least it will be in my next campaign.
That is a new way of looking at it, for sure.
I am setting some really high expectations in my own mind. I can never release my actual campaign.
You're writing checks your body can't cash.
Yeah.
No, I think it is important to narrate everything. To let your DM know what it is that you want to do. And then, not narrate the success of it. Tell him your intent, as you said. Then let's bring the dice into it and see how that goes for you, buddy.
Right.
Hopefully well. Fingers crossed, we're all rooting for you. But when you pass a saving throw, narrate it. Now, I think, especially for the DMs, because when the DM speaks, the players listen, because what the DM says is truth, right? If the player says it, they're waiting for the DM to say, yes, that's what happened. When the DM says it, there is no waiting. That's what happened.
Man, I hope that is the case at your tables, and I wish it was the case at every table, that whenever the DM spoke, the players all listened. If they are not currently listening to you, maybe this kind of narrative, descriptive, dare I say cinematic way of describing the fights will actually pay off for you. Maybe get their attention back in and keep them engaged. That's our intent anyway. You can also use this approach to describe, say, damage resistances or damage immunities.
Exactly.
So, if you're attacking a ghost, your scimitar slashes through the ghost, its form barely rippling as your blade swings through it, meeting almost no resistance, as though you were cutting through smoke instead of flesh. It's a possibility.
Sure.
Yeah. Although, be careful if you rely too much on narratively describing mechanical implications.
Yeah, so it can be tricky sometimes when you say that someone deals a particularly damaging hit, and you eloquently describe the damage dealt kind of in the way that you've been doing. A player can infer from that things that you did not mean to imply. Or the opposite could be true. They may not pick up on what you're putting down when you're trying to express to them that this creature is resistant to the type of damage they just dealt, or perhaps vulnerable to the type of damage that they just dealt.
Right. Let's say my description was very, descriptive about your scimitar not really connecting in the way that you would expect when you're trying to swing at the ghost, but what it doesn't actually mechanically tell you is that ghost is resistant to that damage, and that's very valuable information for the player to know. So be careful that you don't swing the needle too far in the other direction. If there's a mechanical implication to what you're saying, make sure you convey that. That's really important.
Right, and the character who just swung that sword knows that he affected the ghosts some, but he also knows that he's not doing the kind of damage that he's used to doing. The character is better informed than the player when you describe the action in that way. So it's great practice, I think, to follow that up by just stating plainly what the character knows about what just happened. Like, you think that he was resistant to the type of damage that you just dealt. Or conversely, if you are taking a warhammer to a skeleton who is vulnerable to bludgeoning damage, and you describe as the head of that warhammer swings through, breaking bones and shattering ribs, crushing through this creature's body. That sounds incredibly, evocative and descriptive, and it sounds like you're narrating the scene in a believable way.
Yes.
But what you need to make sure that the character takes away from that, what the players take away from that, because the character knows, wow, that did more damage than I was expecting. He looks wrecked by what I just did. I should maybe tell my friends to pull their hammers out.
Right, because he is vulnerable to that type of damage. And remember, this is a role-playing game. It is a game. You want to make sure that you're not withholding any information from your players that could help them play the game better.
Right, and, things like that, we're going to talk later about metagaming and how it has a very negative stigma in this hobby, and often deservedly so. But knowing how the game works is something that your players should be able to expect from you. You should have your players back as the DM to let them know what their characters would know in any given situation.
Right, because an important part of playing this game is understanding the context so that you can make an informed decision about what you want to do with your turn, so that you can achieve the effect that you want to, or at least have a chance of doing so.
This is, I don't really have a great segue for this, but something, when it comes to narrating the actions in combat, something that I found myself doing when faced with a player who has not been the most engaged, or who maybe had to step away from the table for a moment, is that I will narrate the entire last round of combat for the benefit of that character every time their turn comes up or when they return to the table. And something that I intend to start doing going forward is to take all of the little moments that have occurred through the round, what Llewellyn did on his turn, and what Rin did on her turn, and what Gore did on his turn, and what the Green Dragon or the Lich or the minions or that Gnoll did on their turns, and just giving it a nice sweeping narrative, a quick recap at the start of every round, so everyone can kind of get a quick refresher on the stakes and the state of the scene that we're all building together.
And we have a game tomorrow night, so if we get into any combats, we'll let you know how that goes. So far, we have talked about how to be more engaging and more narrative and more descriptive with regards to your characters' attacks, with their turn in combat, with their saving throws, with damage resistances and damage vulnerabilities. But there is one more area that, at least for me, has always been a little odd and a little confusing, and I haven't really known how to accurately represent it in the game that I ran. And I've seen a bunch of DMs take different approaches. So Rob, talk to me a little bit about hit points.
All right, so as you stated earlier, this is a game, and the game has rules, and the game has risks. And one of those risks is that your character is going to die. And that's something that you kind of sign up for when you sit down to play the game with a character that has hit points, that has a health bar, that has an amount of life that can be depleted. Hit points represent the distance between your character being as far from death as possible and as close to death as possible.
I think the health bar analogy that you use is actually a really good one, because it does work a little bit like it does in a video game. You'd expect to see a health bar in a video game, and in a video game, as long as you have 1 point of health left, your character remains 100% combat effective. And D&D is the same way.
Sure. I mean, maybe in a cover-based shooter, you might have some red splotches near the corner of your screen, or maybe your character walks with a little bit of a limp in a survival horror game, but they keep moving, they keep fighting, and their speed doesn't really suffer from their injuries. They're operating at practically 100% functioning capacity.
So when I came to tabletop RPGs and D&D, this was really confusing to me. And I don't know why it was, because I'd played video games before, like Oblivion and Skyrim and Dark Souls and things like that. But for some reason, I had a different expectation when it came to a role-playing game like this, a tabletop role-playing game. I thought, man, my character has a 25 hit point pool, and I've taken a bunch of damage, and I'm down to 1 hit point. My guy must be wrecked. Like, how do I still have all my limbs attached? I'm thinking of hit points as literally a measure of my proximity to death. But maybe it's not actually that way.
You know, the way that I act when I stub my toe on a coffee table, you would think that I had been reduced to within an inch of my hit point pool being depleted. And I certainly don't operate at 100% capacity. So if you can imagine someone being in combat with an enormous monster like an owlbear or a green dragon, how losing hit points might make them feel, I can kind of see where you're coming from. That some logic dictates that you must be suffering when your hit points approach single digits or the dreaded 0.
For sure. And so when I ran a game, I hadn't really resolved this in my own mind, so it was very difficult for me to realistically dramatize the amount of damage that the players and their enemies were receiving. So, how do you handle this sort of thing at your table? What is your perspective on hit points? Let me hear from you, because you're the ones who's been doing this for so long, and then let me tell you the ideas that I've had, and we'll kind of see how they line up.
So, I'll admit that when I came into the hobby, I kind of accepted hit points as they were. That I was playing a heroic badass who is capable of superhuman feats and who is capable of surviving superhuman amounts of damage. And that they could take a blow from a incredibly skilled swordsman, or be buffeted about by the tail of a red dragon and stand back up and come back for more. As I've continued to play the game, that has shifted somewhat. You know, even if I am dealing a large amount of damage to a player character, I'm usually narrating it as a glancing blow or as a significant body blow or some kind of laceration, rarely a mortal wound, until we actually get to the point of 0 hit points. Mm-hmm. Because even true badasses, even combat veterans and people who have been through a lot mentally and physically, don't tend to walk away from mortal wounds without divine intervention. In D&D, sometimes literally. You know, healing magic. I've come around to thinking of hit points as being a line of defense, more so than a measure of the blood that is currently still where it's supposed to be inside your body. You know, it is your ability to take damage, not the amount of damage you have taken. And I know that seems like I'm saying the same thing and saying that it's different.
No, that's a very important distinction that I'm very glad that you made. It is not a measure of, you know, like you were saying, how much blood is left in your body. It's how much more fight is still in you, which is how I have come to think.
I think that's a better way of putting it than I did, actually.
Well, I defined things because, you know, I type up notes for these things, and I'm like, how do I really define hit points? So, in my mind, hit points are now a measure of your character's resolve and endurance, both mental and physical. Okay? It incorporates their physical health, their general toughness, their fitness and stamina, how long they can keep this up, and their defensive skill. It can also encapsulate their resolve to keep on going, their will to live, their mental endurance, and their capability to fend off despair. So this is assaulted by direct damage, both to their bodies and their armor. It can be assaulted by a war of attrition with their opponent, just the fact that they're getting worn down. That shield is only as useful as long as you maintain the strength to lift it. Your mind could be assaulted by various, effects or psychic damage. When I was writing this, it kind of brought to mind a line from The Lord of the Rings where Theoden said, in his despair, as they were waiting to be killed in the center of Helm's Deep, "What can man do against such reckless hate?" And that, to me, represented Theoden's lack of resolve. He had lost his will to live, despair had set in, and he was mentally, if not physically, out of the fight.
Oh yeah, the Dark College of Whispers Bard Wormtongue was definitely dealing psychic damage to him over the long haul.
Yeah. Fortunately, he had Aragorn there to give him a healing word. He didn't physically cure Theoden or any of his injuries, but he reinvigorated him with resolve. The horn of Helm Hammerhand shall sound in the deep one last time. And as we were prepping for this podcast, like literally minutes before we started rolling, I got to thinking about how healing someone's HP is actually impacted. Maybe that healing word isn't actually closing a wound. Maybe that character has only taken psychic damage up to this point. What wounds are you closing with your healing word? No, you are healing his psyche. You are giving him back his resolve. You're reminding him of his reason to keep on going.
You're offering hope.
Exactly. So that's my new perspective on what hit points represent. Not so much, like you said, it was a great phrase, so I'm going to steal it now. Not so much how much blood is left in your body, but how long can you keep this up without falling?
I really like that. Clearly you put some thought into this, and you've made a compelling argument there.
This is my soapbox episode. I'm going to have to warn people at the beginning of this episode. Steve's going to talk. Steve's going to talk in this episode. This is where the players... this is what the players are here for, and this is how you can give it to them.
I will say, just for the sake of argument, that I've heard of hit points being represented as your character's luck. Like, when your hit points run out, your luck runs out. When that sword came through, it just barely grazed you, or it slid off your armor, but you're still taking damage. Your luck is still depleting. And when your hit points reach 0,
your luck runs out.
Your ability to cheat death has expired. Yep, that next strike is coming straight for you, buddy. But, even knowing that metaphor, that comparison, that benchmark for hit points, I think I like your way of looking at things better.
Yeah, I've heard the representation of your character's luck or their fate before, and it is valid. I think that is a perfectly acceptable way to look at HP in D&D.
Sure.
But I'm going to be honest, I don't like it as much either. I don't think it's as narratively compelling to say, oh, well, I guess this one gotcha.
Would you rather be the character who it happened to miss me, or the character who took it and came back for more?
Right, or would you rather be the character who, it's just your time, fate has decided that you've run out of luck, and this is the blow that's going to be a mortal wound for you? Or would it be, you have been suffering under the merciless onslaught of the storm giant for the last 3 rounds, and you just can't raise your shield anymore, so when this next blow comes down, all you can do is stare it in the face and accept that you are going to be taking the full brunt of this blow.
And then, assuming that this is a giant from Skyrim, you will bounce straight off the ground and rocket into the air.
The ragdoll physics of Skyrim. never change. It's the only thing that made that even somewhat acceptable.
I haven't played any of like the new re-releases of Skyrim. I hope they kept that in. They had to have, right?
I think so. We'll have to go check it out on YouTube because I'm a dad who doesn't have time to play video games anymore.
I say I can't start Skyrim again. That was a 20-year-old Rob thing. That was too much time.
All right. Well, hey, you know what? I'm really encouraged that we landed on the same place on hit points because this is something that I have cobbled together from a couple of different sources. But I've only run one game and I haven't implemented it yet. So to hear that this is something that works for you really works for me.
You know, I think that's really in the spirit of D&D Wannabe, and what I'm trying to espouse here is that the desire to put in the work to get better at this game on either side of the screen, as a dungeon master or as a player, is worth it and is, in a lot of ways, its own reward. And that you and those around you who enjoy this hobby alongside you will only benefit from it.
Hell yeah, we're on brand. All right. So today, our goal was to try to give you a couple of ways that you can make your combat more engaging, specifically through using some descriptive terminology and some narrative elements to really draw in the rest of the table into what is taking place within the story. Try to set a scene and give them a cinematic interaction between the different participants in the combat.
These little tips should help you make your combats more interesting, more dramatic, more dynamic, and therefore more memorable.
Right. We've talked a little bit about how to reinforce and continue to help establish the heroism and the competence of your player characters and the other heroes involved, while also using any bad rolls of the dice not to damage the player's impressions of their characters, but to reinforce the threat that the villains pose to them. We've talked about how to do this for melee combatants, for ranged combatants, for spellcasters, how this can apply to damage resistances and vulnerabilities. We've talked about hit points and how to maybe utilize those a little bit better than the way that you might classically think of them. I will say I looked that up in the Dungeon Master's Guide right before the episode started. It does say that that is a representation of your character's health, which was a little disappointing to me, but at least I know where I got that impression when I started the game. So hopefully this has been of some use to you. Rob, if our listeners have appreciated your input, where can they find more of it?
So I am D&D Wannabe on Twitter, the D&D Wannabe at gmail.com. I am a content creator and a writer of articles, modules, and books related to 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. Products of mine are being sold on mistymountaingaming.com, and you can find several things that I have written either in their store or on their dungeon feed.
And that is D&D Wannabe, just in case anyone was going to try to drop an ampersand in there. And folks, if you've appreciated anything that I have had to say throughout the course of this episode,
which was a lot.
Yep, this was my, what'd you call it, my soapbox episode. But don't worry, I have a lot more things to say, and if you want to hear them, you'll just have to tune in for the next episode. Thank you so much for stopping by. The outro music you're listening to right now is called Mega Epic, and the intro music is called Super Epic. Both were composed by the wonderfully talented Alexander Nakarada and utilized under a Creative Commons license. You can find more of his music at serpentsoundstudios.com. If you enjoyed our content, please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and review on your listening app of choice. To keep up with us on social media, look us up on facebook.com/Bardic Twinspiration and on Twitter @BTwinspiration. Want to interact with us directly? Come join our Discord. After all, who are we if not people who are willing to roll the dice on making some new friends? Links in the description. Come check it out. Are you down for starting from the intro?
I am. I would like to selfishly plug myself at the beginning, or you plug me at the beginning, as long as we're getting
No, yeah, that makes...
D&D wannabe out there somehow. I felt this was a better energy for us today.
We're improving.
Yeah.
All right, I'm going to do a wrap up. And then you're going to plug yourself. You ready?
That also sounds dirty. But okay, if you say so.
And you said it first. So much editing I have to do on this one. Okay, here we go.